All right. All right. So let's talk about session. So as you might know already, HTTP is a stateless protocol, right? Meaning when a server receives a request, it handles that request, and then it completely forgets about that request, right? So even if it's the same, if the request comes from the same exact client, the server has no native mechanism to realize that the request might be coming from the same client. And this was by design, but it became a limitation to the types of applications that we could implement, right? Because the server had no way of remembering anything about any particular request. Right? So early on, we hit this limitation of the HTTP protocol, and we were looking for mechanisms to be able to solve this issue. Right? The mechanism that at the end ended up being pervasive and still in wide use today is the use of cookies, right? Where the client, together with the server, they agree for the client to maintain some kind of information that uniquely identifies the client. Right? The server will ask the client to remember something, a token that the server can then write down, and whenever it sees the same cookie being provided by a client, the server can look up that cookie that was generated and realize that it's the same client. Right? And on top of this, very low-level mechanism, we can build all sorts of very interesting higher-level mechanisms to maintain session information, right? So that we can keep track of object or instances of objects based, mapped to or indexed by these tokens. Right? And so that's the mechanism of the cookie. So the way it works is that a user, Alice, goes to a browser, and it's navigating for the first time to acme.com. The browser checks to see if locally it has any cookies stored for that domain. Right? It might be the very first time that it has never gone to this domain, so it has no cookies stored for that domain. And says, oh, no cookies. So it goes out to the server and says, server, I'm sorry, this is my very first time visiting you. And the server says, okay, well, I have no cookies from you, so I'll create one for you. I'll create in Java, typically the cookies have the following name: JSession ID. It's a very common cookie name in Java world. But this could be anything that the server knows to look up at some point later on, right? Whatever it agrees. But this is a very common name. So JSession ID equals to some unique identifier that randomly generated, and that is sent over to the browser. The browser says, oh, okay, I see that you're sending me a cookie. I will agree, if the browser has cookies turned on, I will agree that for acme.com, right, for that URL, for that domain, I will make a note that that's the cookie that domain wants. So if ever I try to communicate with you next time around, I will pass this URL, this cookie to you. Right? Whatever the server does with it, it's the server's business, right? But the browser only agrees to provide this cookie from there on. Okay? All right. Now, on top of this very low-level mechanism, right, we're going to build an entire API. We're going to create an API, which is called the HTTP Session API. The Session API is Java server's mechanism that allows you to create a hash table, basically a hash map that is keyed off of the value of this session ID. So every user, right? So this is Alice. If Bob comes in here, Bob is going to go through the entire mechanism, but they're going to get a different session ID. Right? They'll get ASD 234, whatever. Right? So when Alice comes in here, she's going to provide QWE123. If Bob comes in here, Bob will provide ASD234. Right? And that's how the server is going to be able to tell them apart. Say, oh, it's Alice again, or it's Bob again. Make sense? Right? Now, the value of this cookie is going to be used as an index. Right? It's an index into a data structure that the server is going to maintain, keyed off of this value. So that if Alice comes in here, this is going to key off into Alice's data store. But if Bob comes in here, this is going to key off of to some other data store. Okay? That data store is accessible through an API called the HTTP Session API. Right, that allows us to put stuff in the data store and retrieve stuff from the data store. Which data store? Well, if it's Alice, it'll be Alice's data store. If it's Bob, it'll be Bob's data store. Make sense? Right, now, this underlying mechanism of data storage and all that and handling the cookies and the indexing, all that is transparent to us. The only thing we see on our end is just this session. Right? And everything that happens behind it, all the cookies and the indexing, all that, is completely transparent to us. Yes?
So do we maintain state in single page application? Because in general we talk with RESTful web services, and if we maintain state, won't it impact the scalability?
Yeah, I was going to make that point. I did early on that I was going to cover that. Yes. Right. So as our colleague points out, ideally, one of the problems of maintaining any session whatsoever, right, is that if you have one user, I'll have to instantiate a data store for that particular user. If there's 100 users that come in here, I have to instantiate 100 data stores for these 100 users that have come in and identified themselves. So that kind of starts to limit me on the amount of infrastructure that I have to support for 1, 100, 1,000, 10,000 users that are providing these cookies, right? Even if they are not interacting with me, I need to maintain them at least for a minimum amount of time. Typically, these sessions time out. The default timeout is 30 minutes. So these data stores hang out in the CPU memory, right, for amount of time that eventually are cleaned out, right? If there's no activity for the same cookie coming from the client, the server will automatically clean up and remove these sessions that are sticking on the server. So maintaining any state information is expensive, right? It impacts the footprint of the server that is running on the CPU, right? I need a CPU. I need more memory. I need to maintain this memory for the. So ideally, we would try to minimize whatever session information we keep track of, right? And that's kind of the trade-offs that we want to consider. Another way of maintaining session is not to provide any session information here. Instead of the cookie, all the information could be part of the path parameter. Right? The path parameter that we just used earlier, right, could be used, right, to maintain the state information. If I pass in the cookie information in the path, there's no need for maintaining any information about you. Right? I can always map that against a query in the database. I can say, okay, well, it's you again. Right? I can go in and hit the database, do a query, and provide you with the information, as opposed to having to remember you in the CPU. Make sense? Right? Nevertheless, we're going to learn how to maintain. We're going to learn how to use both, how to map in a path parameter and do a query in the database, and also maintaining session information. All right, so let's play around with a session. Let's create a REST controller that will allow us to play around with this. Okay, so let's call it HTTP session examples. Let's see in here in the services, we'll say new class HTTP session. There it is. It'll be a REST controller. And let's see, we'll load that. And invalidate already? No, let's do a set session attribute. Oops. copy. Okay, so let's look at this. So what this says is that we're creating a URL pattern. It starts with API, right, /session, right, /set. So that's the beginning of the URL pattern. And then an attribute and then a value, 2 placeholders. And we're going to pass them in as path variables. We're going to parse them out from the path, and we're going to map them to these 2 variables, attribute and value. Notice that one other thing we are injecting here, not only these 2 variables, we're also injecting this weird HTTP session. See that? Right? We're asking the framework to not only parse these 2 things out of the path parameters, we're also asking, hey, give me the session object that might be associated to the current cookie, if there is one. Right? If there isn't, hey, send the cookie back. So this HTTP session object represents all the underlying mechanism that receives a cookie or not, generates a new cookie and sends it back, if there is one. And so that's all hidden from us from this API underneath. Right? All the cookie information, all the indexing, everything is done and hidden from us from this session object. The session object is just a data store. It's just like a hash table. A hash table that I can use any key and then any value that I can store in there. Right? So the key is a string, and then the value can be any object. In this case, it's another string. Right? But it could be any object. It could be a user. It could be a courses. It could be a list of things. It could be a fairly complex, heavy object. Okay? In this case, we're just storing an arbitrary value for an arbitrary attribute just to see that indeed it's working. Right? So we have session attribute. So this one sets the attribute. Let's now get the attribute. Let's copy that. So this one allows us to, it's the mirror image of the setting. Right? This is going to set, it says get, and then an attribute, presumably an attribute that already exists in the session. Right? And then notice that it uses get attribute. So from that hash table, we're going to retrieve the string that we stored early on. Okay? So let's, and finally, we had another one, invalidate. Invalidate allows us to throw away anything that we're remembering about this particular session. Right? Throw it away. Maybe somebody logged out, right? Or whatever, right? We invalidate it. So let's copy that, and let's add it here. All right, so let's restart the server and just play around with this for a second. And here we'll webdev. Oh, let's save this. This is create user. I'm going to save it in fall. Save. Let's create another one. So this is localhost HTTP, localhost 8080, and this is API. What was it? Set, that's the API. So we can try name Alice. So, and this will be a get, is it? I think it's a get, right? Get. All right, notice that it responds with name equal Alice. Let me save that. So this is, we'll call this, what do we call it here? Set session attribute. So let's save that. Save. And I'm going to clone this, duplicate, and this will be get session attribute. And this will be get name, save, and send. Notice that it remembers Alice, right? It sent the cookie. It says, "Oh, it's the same person," and it retrieves it. Notice that if I go to Safari and I hit the same get name, it doesn't retrieve anything, right? If I say set name, so set name Bob, and then I retrieve it, get name, it returns Bob. But if I am in Chrome, and I go to localhost 8080, and I say API/set/name/Charlie, returns Charlie, right? And if I get the name, oops, this returns Charlie. So if I refresh, so Chrome has its own session that has nothing to do with somebody else's session, right? Notice like this keeps returning Bob. It remembers from the last session, right? If it didn't have session, it wouldn't remember anything. Make sense? So this would allow us to start implementing things such as login, register, retrieve profile, and things like that, right? So let's play around with that too.